And the next panel will probably continue where the previous left off, by discussing the political trends that we observe today. With some notable exceptions, populist politicians and parties are visibly on the rise. What are the causes of this phenomenon? The title of the panel is Understanding Populist Electorates: Who Votes Populists Back into Office and Why? And we open this session with a keynote by Ivan Krastev, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies, and Albert Hirschman, permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Sorry, these chairs are taken. Okay. I'm really sorry for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. When I see about the keynote speech, I understand that there is a key, but I'm not sure that there is a door to open with it. So from this point of view, this is just the first intervention in the panel that will start. And secondly, I'll start with something very simple, but probably if somebody is going to calculate the number of conferences devoted for democracy and populism in the last 15 years per capita, Budapest is going to end up as one of the high places. So the first question is, has something changed? Is this the same conversation? And some of the colleagues who are going to speak, basically they have been doing an empirical research on the populist vote. This is not what I have been doing. So I'll try to make just 4 major points, basically, to start, to be part of the discussion after that. The first is somewhere at the end of the 19th century, Walter Budget, famous British liberal of his period, he said monarchy is the best form of government because most of the people don't know any other. And in his view, basically societies are run mostly by the poverty of their political imagination. And the truth is that somewhere at the end of the 20s and the beginning of the 21st century, democracy looks like monarchy at the end of the 19th century. People basically identify democracy with modernity. And not simply democracy, but liberal democracy. And I do believe that the first thing that we should realize is that suddenly the poverty of political imagination is over. There is a certain type of a different alternative views of basically what people are seeing, how they're seeing, and democracy is not identified with liberal democracy anymore in different places, even in Europe. And one of the major reasons is that while defense of the property rights on one side and defense of the right of the majority to govern after elections are going to be still recognized and accepted in most of the world, the most important is about the rights of the minorities. And part of the story is that the rights of the minorities, to a great extent, have been guaranteed and became part of the package as a result of major international order, which was dominated by the United States as a liberal hegemon. And this is not the case. And Pavel Zerka before said that probably in 20 years, nobody's going to remember Donald Trump, and this could be true. But listen, probably many people don't know who is Mikhail Gorbachev, but he changed the system. Because he changed the nature, because suddenly the United States, from a liberal hegemon, basically went into the antagonist of the system that the United States has created. And this is changing very much the domestic political dilemma. And from this point of view, our talk about the rise of populism and the populist parties and so on is very different than the one that we have before. I remember in 2015, in his very classical, colorful style, when the Polish Law and Justice parties won the elections, Adam Michnik said, it happens that a beautiful girl goes at home with a bastard. Listen, probably, but in a certain way, after the government was re-elected, you should agree that probably it was not a one-night stand. So from this point of view, trying and getting and understanding the rise of populism simply as a certain type of a accident, phenomena, and so on does not work. We are talking about the transformation of the democratic political system. In a certain way, many of these parties that have been defined rightly so as anti-system parties are now part of the definition of the system. And this is a different conversation. And my first point is, normally there was a kind of belief that when these parties, which were quite often elected on the protest vote, are going to enter in power, they're never going to be re-elected again, because when they're in power, they're basically going to show their weakness. It is not going to work. The empirical truth, at least in Europe, is that when a populist party comes to power, the chance to be re-elected is even higher. And the coming elections in the Czech Republic basically is going to probably prove it. So from this point of view, just to try to see them as a protest party does not work anymore. The second thing, which also I found quite important, is that when this happened, how you're responding. And the natural response was, let's fight them saying we are defending democracy. And this is noble and basically works as a common sense. The problem is that in a highly politically polarized societies, everybody is defending democracy. Because in this society, the biggest risk for democracy is the party for which you are not voting to win. 1/3 of the Republicans who voted for Donald Trump on the last presidential elections, when being interviewed after the elections and asked why they voted, they said, in order to defend democracy. And this, as you remember, was the major, basically, slogan of the Democratic Party. I'm saying this that, as a result of it, some of this kind of a discourse, which comes as very natural, particularly when you have a very much dominant mainstream, and these parties who are coming just as challengers are not going to be effective in the way they were. The second was try to portray and to frame the conflict with the populist party as the conflict between sanity and insanity, normality and abnormality. But listen, keep in mind that for many people, what you are telling normal is just the status quo. And there is a push for change. Even many liberal voters want change. And there are cycles in politics, and we can talk many things, but there is these psychological cycles, and the moment you start to defend the status quo, in a certain way, you're in a very weak position. Because in a certain way, people are really asking for very different type of changes. And by the way, there is a kind of this revolutionary fever, and every revolution is a many different revolutions in themselves. But when people want change, the worst thing to promise them is that you're going to restore something that they know that it's never going to come back. And for me, this is a real political challenge when it comes how you basically are responding to this. And then you go, in my view, also for the real question. In order to understand the drama, the real drama of the situation is not to see who is voting for the populist party, but to see why it is so difficult to be a post-populist liberal government. Look Poland. Look other places. By the way, if Hungary, if the opposition is going to win elections, this is going to be the extreme case of this. Because then suddenly, after the institutions for years have been basically staffed with people that have been loyal to these parties and others, you come on the ticket of the rule of law. But what two colleagues recently defined, you are basically facing the post-populist trilemma. In order to respond to the public expectations, which was the case in Poland in 2023, you should be fast, effective, and legal because you have been insisting on the rule of law. The problem is that you can be only two of them. You can be very fast and effective, but it is going to be not very easy basically to stay with the legal norms because in a certain way the same legal system that you are talking about, suddenly the Constitutional Tribunal and so on and others, have been very much staffed by people who had much more partisan loyalties. And then you're in a trap. Then in a certain way, you're really either contributed to even more politicization and basically total erosion in the trust in the neutral institutions, particularly court, central bank, and others, or you start to look so ineffective, and as it was said before, because normally the populists are voted out of government by very difficult coalitions, these coalitions are really becoming a nightmare when it comes to the decision making. And I'm saying this because from this point of view, the most interesting things to understand the depths of the problem is not Poland, and it's not going to be Czech Republic, but it is the United Kingdom. If there was a place where you believe that central-left government could be effective after winning elections, it was Britain for three simple reasons. Strong liberal tradition. Secondly, big majority. And thirdly, Brexit was a failure. Even people who voted for Brexit are going to recognize that it didn't work. So if it can work somewhere, it was in Britain. And suddenly it does not work. The government is unpopular. Of course, many things can change, but the government is surprisingly unpopular for such a short period. And in my view, if we're not going to understand why, it's going to be very difficult. And I don't go into classical British politics because I want to make just the last 2 points which for me are critically interesting. One is that if something dramatically changed with this war, and from this point of view, of course, President Trump is extremely important, is that what was changed was the intensity of politics. Look at the two groups that in a certain way, ideologically, the most strong, the most committed. On the left, it's obviously the environmental left. They're people who really care about climate. And on the right, I'm going to put it the demographic anxiety right, the great replacement people who are very much anti-migration, and they believe that this is the most important thing. What is important for both of the groups is that there is no time. If we're not going to change the thing now, tomorrow is going to be too late. The problem is that part of the strength of democracy is that there is always tomorrow. The strength of democracy is that you always can postpone certain problems for tomorrow. Certain understanding of the future, which is not apocalyptic in its nature, in my view is a precondition for the functioning democratic system. If I believe that if I'm not going to win these elections, next elections does not make sense, better to win. And I'm saying because this level of urgency, suddenly politics has been transformed into a kind of a version of this famous truth or dare game. Either you're basically pushed to answer a question which is very uncomfortable or do something very daring, but the very legitimacy for the politicians come from transgression. Doing something that in a certain way is beyond the normal politics. In order to prove the people that you are serious, you should know something that basically is violating certain rules. And I'm saying this because also comes the issue which was touched on very much on the last conversation. In order to understand, in my view, people who are voting for the far right in different places, particularly when migration is the major issue, and from this point of view, Western Europe is a very different case because you really have a much more people in these places. You should understand that what they have the feeling that they're losing is the sense of home. Simply the change is very fast. And home is a place where you believe that you understand and you believe that you are understood. And this kind of a level of homelessness, of course, is very much shared also by migrants because they're coming to a totally different environment, which is totally new for them, which basically they try to understand. And suddenly you have two groups of migrants. On one, those who cross the border in a way, in a belief that they're coming to the future, and on the other, those migrants who are voting for the far-right party who want to migrate back in time. Because the only way to migrate back in time is with the vote for the far right. What they're promising is to return you the country in the way it was. And you know that they're not going to return you the country as it was. But in my view, if they're not going to be strengths on the side of the political parties to redefine what it means at home. And in English, at least in my Bulgarian school, we are told that feel free and feel at home are synonymous. So from this point of view, I do believe that the major challenge for any liberal party is to give a definition of home where people can feel free at home. If they're not going to have this, you're going to have this level of intensity politics, which is eroding democratic institutions to the extent that while the institutions are there, basically the politics which is taking place within these institutions has nothing to do with the definition of liberal democracy. So as I told you, I have a key, but I don't have a door to open. Thank you.